Thank you for joining us today to strengthen industry relationships, advance the global dialogue, and learn from one another so that we may advance our efforts worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I just want to go back here and go over some housekeeping. First, I just want to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. We will have time at the end for questions and discussion at the end of each session. And as an audience member, you are muted and your videos are off by default. If you have a question, you can put it into the chat, in the Q&A function. The chat is disabled. There's a Q&A function, and you can ask a question at any time. We'll be monitoring that, and we will ask your question during the Q&A period, or if you would like to be unmuted to ask your question using your own voice rather than typing it in, we can unmute you during the Q&A period. So with that, again, thanks to Jeff, and I would also like to thank him for his service as the chair of the Global Membership Council. I'd now like to introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Mr. Mike Peterson. Mike is the Deputy Commissioner of the Climate and Sustainability Branch of the California Department of Insurance. In this role, he leads multiple initiatives to reduce climate risk and strengthen resilience, including leading a partnership with the United Nations Principles for Sustainable Insurance Roadmap. This is the first time the UN has participated with a US state to create a sustainable insurance strategy and action plan. Mike's work on the California Climate Insurance Working Group focuses on resiliency through closing protection gaps and employing nature-based solutions. In fact, the Climate Insurance Working Group this summer published a set of 40 recommendations for the state's Department of Insurance, local and state policymakers, and the insurance industry regarding the role of insurance in addressing risks from climate-fueled wildfires, floods, and extreme heat. These recommendations are the first of their kind in the US, and Mike was intimately involved in this process, so we're very fortunate to have him with us today to talk about the process and the outcomes, hopefully giving all of us some forward-looking concepts to consider and our own areas of responsibility. To our virtual audience, again, we'd love to engage you in our dialogue today. So please put any questions that you have during the course of this discussion into the Q&A box, and we have reserved time to address those at the end of each presentation. Mike, thank you so much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the chance to be here and speak at such a an important, fascinating symposium today. You know, to start with, I just wanted to say, okay, there you go. You know, my name is Mike Peterson, and I am the Deputy Commissioner on Climate and Sustainability for the Department of Insurance here in California. And the report that we're going to be talking about today, and I'll be going through the major themes, is a collaborative work. And I think that at its core is a combination of a public entity and a number of different academics, environmental groups, insurers and reinsurers, who collectively came together and worked for nearly 2 years to come up with some recommendations. And I think that for the group here today, there's a couple things that I really want you to hopefully take away with as I walk you through some of what I think are the highlights of the report. And that's that, you know, when we talk about risk reduction and risk transfer and risk mitigation, you know, there are opportunities to link things together and to organize ourselves in a way that really prioritizes the best of the risk mitigation in a holistic way. And so this report is how we organize mitigation. It's also how we integrate across multiple different risks that we're facing as we look at climate impacts. So the report's entitled Protecting Communities, Preserving Nature, and Building Resiliency. And I think that you'll find as I walk through here that we'll hit each of those themes for an equal amount of time. So if you could head to the first slide, I'll jump right in here. Great. Thank you. Well, this is where this narrative begins. You know, the protection gap is something that many of the audience will well know, and that's that after every major event, there are certain costs that are insured and covered in a stronger, kind of more diversified way, and there are costs that are not covered by insurance. And that gap between those two benchmarks has been growing worldwide, but also in California. And when we talk about this, because the wildfire issue has been such a publicized and tragic recent trend in California, sometimes we end up, focusing completely on that issue. But as you'll see in this report, protection gaps fall into categories for different perils, whether they're extreme heat events, extreme rainfall events, flooding that comes from sea level rise, or downstream impacts of drought. And so I think that, for a meeting today that's focused on extreme weather and building codes, that kind of holistic approach, we need to also apply to how we think about the protection gap. Next slide, please. So the second piece of the puzzle is that this protection gap doesn't hit every community in the same way. Many of the most vulnerable communities in California are projected to face the most destructive consequences of climate risk impacts. And so when a disaster occurs, we tend to see a trend where the magnitude and speed of financial response can be crucial to recovery. But when disaster aid is limited or delayed, that gap is going to hurt the most vulnerable, those without a financial backstop. Without, a type of insurance or a disaster aid that's run by the state, that puts many costs on individuals, households, and communities who may rely on credit, may rely on savings. But as you get to those financial mechanisms, you're going to really put a lot of costs on folks who don't have as strong a financial backstop, and that's going to have inequity in terms of the consequences. And so this working group, I want to put these two slides up front because that's really the starting point of this, is that if we do have protection gaps and we do have impacts that are going to disproportionately affect vulnerable communities, what do we do about it? How do we address climate change and insurance in a way that reduces the damages and the losses to those who are most vulnerable? So next slide, please. Okay, so how does a report like this come to be? This climate insurance working group report was a nearly 2-year project. The working group itself was established in state legislation back in 2018. So the state of California directed the Department of Insurance, or specifically the insurance commissioner, to convene a working group to address a series of problems related to climate change and insurance consequences. Commissioner Ricardo Lara, who's the commissioner in California, convened the group in September of 2019. It has 18 members that span a variety of public policy expertise. So you'll find people who've worked at the federal level and people who've worked at the state level, those who are from insurance and reinsurance companies, and those who are from environmental groups, environmental justice groups, or other entities that are focused on risk management and risk reduction. And I want to point out that there's a really strong emphasis in both this piece of legislation and the subsequent working group that focused on how do you look at risk in a way that brings natural ecosystems into your matrix of view. How do we bridge some of the gaps between what traditionally are insurance issues and traditionally are environmental issues? And if we're worried about risk that encompasses many of those groups, how do we create a collaborative environment where we can get those folks together and come up with a series of recommendations that hopefully will broaden our approach? And so the working group came up with their mission, and I wrote it out here in lots of words, but I wanted it to be out there for everyone, and that their mission was to identify, assess, and recommend risk transfer approaches to reduce the risks of climate change impacts, including but not limited to insurance incentives that promote nature-based solutions. And so right there up front, they're trying to reduce risks and look at incentives that are related to insurance and merge in nature-based solutions to address some of these impacts. Next slide, please. Now, the working group took this sort of broad question and narrowed it into, I would say, 2 different frameworks to think about. One is that they had to pick how to organize themselves and to tackle the issue. So they chose 3 risks that are 3 of the largest or most significant at this point to California, which are wildfires, extreme heat events, and flooding. And to approach those, they looked at what I refer to as the risk continuum. How do we better assess the risk? How do we better communicate the risk? How do we better reduce the risk? And then once we've got that framework in place, how does risk transfer fit in as a puzzle piece to transfer risk effectively and promote recovery? Because ultimately, if we're focused on resilience, we need to not only reduce risks, but we also need to prepare communities and households for the recovery process so that it is strong and equitable and doesn't put us in a position where we're backsliding on other societal goals while trying to recover from the events themselves. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so we take this framework of risk assessment, risk communication, risk reduction, and risk transfer. That framework was applied to wildfires, extreme heat, and flooding. And then from those recommendations, this framework was integrated back into what we call sort of a cross-cutting approach to those 3 perils. And so we really tried to avoid the situation where you might have a recommendation for wildfire that then exacerbates your risks for flood, or a recommendation for flooding that exacerbates your risk for extreme heat. But to try to the best we could is if we took this approach to have recommendations that you could apply broadly and that would reduce risks and promote recovery across all those perils. So next slide, please. Oops, back 1 slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the categories of things that fit within this framework to give you a sense before we get into more of the recommendations themselves? So under risk assessment, the state of California has put significant resources into doing climate assessments, so, much as the federal government has done, to look at different risks to our natural resources, to our state infrastructure, to our communities. And I think that, from the point of view of insurance, if you're looking at climate change impacts that are accelerating, we need to be able to understand how are risks and vulnerabilities changing, and where are there opportunities to mitigate those risks. Without a core risk assessment, it's very difficult to have a predictable strategy on risk communication, risk reduction, or to promote sustainability in terms of risk transfer options. So once risk assessment's been prioritized, the next step is risk communication. And that, I list 2 examples under risk communication. There are many more in this report. But hazard maps and models are 2 ways in which we take information and communicate it with local governments, the public, other state governments, and the insurance sector. For risk reduction, I think that this is particularly relevant for today, but building codes are an important part of risk reduction. In California, we have specific codes related to wildfire. We also do look at research entities like IBHS and NIST and academic researchers that contribute to codes related to building for other risks as well. As many of you may know, California has some significant earthquake risks. We also have, we are in the midst of a record-setting drought. We have had, since 1992, every county in the state has been under a federally ordered emergency declaration for flooding. And we have tragic and deadly extreme heat events that have occurred. I'd say that the attention's been more focused on them the last 2 years, but have occurred on and off for a number of years. And so I think that as we approach risk reduction, whether it's through building codes or other strategies, we have a lot of things to consider as a state. And that's where I would also bring up that risk reduction in this report, from the standpoint of this working group, there's a substantial focus on land use. How do you use the maps, the models, the projections that we have, and inform a land use policy that can not only avoid the worst outcomes, but can also reduce risks to communities as we try to address the climate change impacts that we see. And finally, when it comes to risk transfer, how do we blend together our risk transfer policies with the codes and mitigation options that we see, so that our risk transfer mechanisms not only are a way to financially plan for pending climate change impacts, but are also a way to encourage that risk reduction. Next slide, please. And we're going to skip right through here. So one more, next slide, please. Excellent. So I want to pause for a moment and just give you a little bit of a forecast of how the rest of the talk will go. Now that you have sort of an introduction to the approach of this working group, I'm going to walk you through the major themes. And each one of them tries to tie some piece of the insurance puzzle back towards resilience. And if you can imagine that, there are 40 recommendations, it's an 80-page report. So there's a lot in there, but I think that by walking you through these 5 themes and giving you some examples, that will present you with an interesting burst of highlights, so that when you go and read the 80-page report, you've got a good foreshadowing of what's in there. So first off, widely available risk information supports resilience, and across all 3 perils, whether it's extreme heat, wildfire, or flooding, the working group identified where there was a lack of clear risk information and how that leads to risky land use decisions and the establishment of developments that are not prepared for those accelerating risks. In California, we have a state established hazard mapping for wildfires. We generally rely on federally established hazard mapping for flooding, and extreme heat is something where we have tools, but they don't tend to align or focus into maps in sort of the traditional sense. And so within the working group's recommendations, one of the primary ones that the state can focus on and have some authority over is to strengthen hazard mapping. Hazard mapping is one of the backbones of how we approach where we build infrastructure, how we apply building codes, what types of planning that local governments are required to pursue and establish. And it's also a communication tool for our communities on what they should be prepared for when it comes to hazards. The hazard maps that are in California, at least for wildfire and flooding, can be updated and made more effective. The second bullet point here is that earlier disclosure information on hazards is an element of making risk information available. That's at the local level. It's also at the home by home purchase level. How do we better communicate what the risk is to people who are choosing where to live, and also how to de-risk those areas? What types of mitigation actions or guidance is available? The state has community wildfire guidance that the Governor's Office of Planning and Research puts together, and that can be really effective if it's adopted, but it needs to be disseminated. Third bullet point here, to increase public understanding of how to risk and de-risk. This is something where for wildfire, the recent events have really kind of encouraged more interest in this topic, but really, one of the most devastating things as the Department of Insurance to see is after a major event, a major flood or a major snowstorm, there's oftentimes a sense amongst the people who were impacted that they were not aware that this was a possibility or a probability. And if they are, what should they do about it? So as our researchers are putting out documents and more information on where the risks are and what do we do about it, we need to have mechanisms that disseminate this information to the public, because we don't want situations where people don't know their risk. We also don't want situations where they know their risk but don't know how to the degree they can, reduce it. And the fourth bullet point here is in terms of early warning systems. There are a multitude of examples where early warnings have not only saved lives, but also reduced damages to buildings, to infrastructure, and to property. And I think that, where we can, from a working group's standpoint, where we can increase the effectiveness of early warning systems, we can make progress at reducing impacts. And the consensus of the working group was that this was particularly important where it comes to heat waves. And that's because their determination was that there's not the same consciousness of heat events as there is for storms and fires, where we do have sort of historical systems where we're able to name storms, rank them into a category that tends to prompt a public policy response. For wildfires here in California, we have sort of a higher and lower system for the danger of a wildfire in any given day, and a number of early warning systems that have come up, especially in the last 5 years, in response to the ferocious wildfires that we've seen in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. And so I just wanted to underscore that the working group put a real premium on an early warning system for heat being important, and that ranking heat waves is something that that should be an immediate focus as a result of this report. And this dovetails nicely with an international effort, the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, which is a collaboration of health officials and insurance and reinsurance companies and other, I would say, international public policy groups to try to figure out if there is a ranking pathway and what that would look like. So next slide, please. The next point is that where and how we build and rebuild matters, and that matters for each of these perils. It's helpful to think of this in two categories. There are existing developments, and in those developments, this working group's consensus was to strongly recommend investing in home and community hardening programs and incentives for risk reduction at the parcel level and at the community level. The working group also noted that when a home or community is rebuilt after disaster, there's an opportunity to build a more climate resilient community. And that can integrate with hazard mapping by requiring stronger building codes. It can also prompt the local government and plans to relook at their general plan to see if there are improvements that can be made during the rebuild for evacuation, for risk reduction like fire breaks, and for protecting homes by local ordinance. For new developments, the working group clearly came up with, I'd say, 2 bullet points that I want to highlight here. One is that we need to clearly identify the risks and future costs of expanding building into high-risk areas. Especially in California, where we have state-level climate assessments, we have increasing data and increasing knowledge on the projections that we expect to see. And so we can look to the future and have a better and better idea of what types of impacts we're likely to see in terms of the duration of heat waves, the severity of fires, the intensity of high rainfall events. And so where we have that information, we need to really be thoughtful about the future costs of building in those areas, for the state, for the communities, and also for insurance. I think that making sure that it is understandable that insurance in some high-risk areas may be less affordable or less available is a critical piece of local planning and land use planning more broadly. And so the working group really focused on how do we strengthen incentives for local governments to adopt community and home risk reduction practices before building additional developments. Knowing how hard it is to do retrofits, how do we do this at the beginning of the process and move these decisions earlier? And so you'll see a common thread here of, trying to move investments earlier, move decision-making and information earlier, invest in early warning systems. And that's because we see examples where early investment saves costs later down the road. One of the prominent pieces of information that this working group considered was that there's a study that's often cited, probably amongst this group quite often, the National Institute of Building Sciences, that for every dollar of pre-disaster mitigation, there tends to be about $6 in saved costs in terms of rebuilding and recovery. And so what that means is, as you're facing accelerating risks, the more specific and optimized that pre-disaster mitigation can be, the more that we can save financially in the aftermath, and that also translates into people's health, well-being, and lives. Next slide, please. Incorporating how we build is how we see the natural ecosystem, the matrix of nature around developments and within developments. And so, as you notice from the mission statement, this group spent nearly every meeting talking in some portion about how investments in nature-based solutions could reduce risks. And they look specifically into expanding nature-based solutions like wetlands, urban greening, and ecological forest strategies to reduce damages to health and structures. And so I'll give you a couple examples. For trying to address urban or extreme heat events, urban forests and urban greening can reduce the ultimate temperature of such events in absorbing some of that heat. And so where we have strategies to increase urban forests in California, if we can link those to the impacts of extreme heat waves, and we can have a much more comprehensive solution to that issue. I think also that there are some strong examples of how wetlands and marshes, whether they're coastal or they're upland or montane, can reduce the flooding impacts to communities. In California, one of the studies that this group really focused on was one out of UC Santa Cruz, who studied the impact of the coastal wetlands in the Northeast United States during Superstorm Sandy, and determined that approximately $625 million of damages were avoided based on the risk reduction impact of those wetlands. In California, we don't currently have hurricanes, but we do have atmospheric rivers. We do have storm surge, and we do have high rainfall events that even though we're in drought, we need to prepare for. And so there was a real focus on how can wetlands be part of a flood strategy in California that then enables flooding insurance to be more available and affordable. Next slide, please. We started this whole talk talking about the protection gap. And so in each one of these perils and each one of these major themes, closing the protection gap was a major emphasis. And that's because when you have underinsurance in a community, that often results in slower rebuilding and it limits the recovery. And this is particularly important because we often in insurance focus on, more of like the homeowner's insurance market as a whole, or the commercial insurance market as a whole. But there are pieces of the puzzle that get less attention, and this group really felt that they were important. And one is that homeowners insurance has high uptake in California, very likely because it's required for a mortgage. But renters insurance has far less uptake. But after a fire or flood, those renters, without the backstop of insurance, are at risk of losing their possessions. They're at risk of being dislocated and not able to move back. They're at risk of having to live for a while in a more expensive area. And so throughout this report, there's always a focus on how does this affect homeowners, how does this affect businesses, how does this affect renters? And so that renters insurance protection gap is particularly important. When you have underinsurance more generally, it contributes to a vicious cycle of economic vulnerability and decline and diminishes capacity for communities to face future events. So if rebuilding is incomplete, if rebuilding is slow, then when you have a series of events, a flood following a fire or a fire following a heat wave, you're going to have your community much more vulnerable and at risk. And this gets back to the top line theme at the very beginning, that the hardest hit will be the most vulnerable, and that's going to exacerbate the already growing social and financial inequities that we see in society. Next slide, please. The fifth major theme that I want to highlight today is that innovative risk transfer policies can expand insurance access. So if we think that our existing insurance policies for businesses, for homeowners, for renters tend to be indemnity policies, and that's sort of the existing framework. What are the policies that, looking forward, need to start being developed today so that we have a stronger pool of potential policies to deal with these accelerating risks? And there's four points I want to make. The first is that there are very few policies that address extreme heat. This is a growing risk, not only in California, but in many places across the globe. Heat can be disruptive, it can be deadly, it can put intense financial costs on the healthcare services, whether that's hospitals, clinics. It can disrupt and put financial stress on transportation. And it also, as local governments try to devise strategies to keep people cooler, there are a number of different challenges that all could require a very immediate need for funding. And so the working group focused at the local level and what a local government may be able to do if insurance policies existed that allowed that local government to respond quickly by establishing cooling centers, identifying the elderly and vulnerable members of their community that may need to be either transported or cooled in their home. But this is the most deadly of the climate perils right now, and is something where the insurance footprint is not quite as strong as it is for wildfire and flooding. Three other areas of innovation. The second one here is community insurance. The working group focused on, okay, if the community is the size or the operational kind of size for organizing mitigation, can we link together community mitigation with community insurance, which can reduce the number of people who slip through the cracks and also incentivize everyone in the community to focus on collective mitigation. And this in California has come up through our recent experience as it relates to wildfire, because many times, wildfire is something that needs not only a home hardening approach, but also a community hardening approach. Because if your neighbor's home catches fire, it's going to put your home at risk, even if you've done a number of home hardening elements. And so trying to identify how could the insurance commissioner and state government colleagues work with communities to co-develop community insurance policy concepts would be a really important innovation here in California. The third bullet point on there, parametric insurance, is one that has received attention for a number of years, but is still very rare when it comes to policies available in California. And when you think of some of the impacts of flooding and some of the impacts of extreme heat, these are areas where a parametric policy could be really effective to try to address a narrow and targeted problem. And that could be getting resources earlier to local governments to respond to heat waves. It could be to have some flood insurance for a major atmospheric river. In California, the working group did some basic research, basic in the sense of just general research, not basic scientific research, on the uptake of flood insurance, and found that Less than 5% of households in California have insurance for flooding. And so parametric insurance may be an option to increase the uptake of flood insurance and decrease the protection gap. And finally, I think most importantly, the nature-based insurance solutions is an innovation that the working group really prioritized. And that is, how do we, whether it's a community insurance policy or a parametric insurance policy, link together nature-based solutions with that policy? Because we need to fortify the link between the risk reduction that an ecologically managed forest may provide and the people who are protected. Next slide, please. Can we go back one slide, please? Great. When it comes to communicating risk, updating hazard maps and strengthening disclosures was one of the elements that I talked about earlier. I want to highlight a couple things about it. First is that California has fire hazard severity maps that were last updated in 2008. So it's been almost 13 years. They also don't include wind as a factor in the severity of the hazard. And so I think that for those to be updated and integrated with the building codes that we require for high fire and very high fire severity areas is a really important future resilience step for the state to take. The current flooding maps that are used by most communities do not include sea level rise, high rainfall events, or groundwater flooding. They were developed with the inundation effects of a river that's rising as the major impetus, and so they're focused on that specific type of flooding. But we do see scientific research that shows that storms are likely to intensify in multiple parts of California. We have a history of major floods in our interior in Sacramento, where I live, from the 1800s, and up in the North Coast near Eureka from the 1960s. And an atmospheric in a dense populated area like Los Angeles would be devastating. And so I think that improving those hazard maps is a major piece of the report, and one that the state can coordinate with the federal government on. And then when it comes to extreme heat, we do have California, I think, has rightly developed some tools that identify urban heat islands and try to classify high heat events. But I think more work needs to be done on this issue, and that work can help us communicate and build a consciousness about heat events in the same way that fire and flooding have been highlighted. Next slide, please. On land use decisions, the report identifies not just where to not build, but how to approach it. So identify areas to invest in conservation to reduce risk, provide strong incentives for community mitigation for new developments, and include community performance metrics in building standards. Oftentimes our building codes focus on the built structure and not necessarily the surrounding area. And I think that we're finding that the community approach is the strongest in terms of mitigation, and the working group really wanted to focus on that community level of mitigation. And finally, there's a recommendation to create an overarching disaster resilience strategy so that we don't have a strategy that focuses so much on wildfire that it pushes people into high flood areas, or so much on flooding that it pushes people into high wildfire areas. Next slide, please. I have 3 remaining points that I want to hit. The first is that there is an opportunity here to combine emissions reduction and adaptation. And the group focused on adaptation primarily, the role of insurance in promoting adaptation. But it said up front that there are the opportunities to combine how we adapt with how we reduce emissions. Because the best long-term strategy is a dramatic reduction in emissions that cause climate change. That's where the ultimate resilience is going to lie. But at the same time, even if we have a fast transition to a low carbon economy, past emissions have already locked in rising temperatures and increasing climate impacts for the foreseeable future. And so there's that balance there, but there's also that opportunity. And so where we have opportunities, whether it's building or rebuilding or designing public policy for increasing resilience and reducing emissions, we should be pursuing those. Next slide, please. As part of nature-based solutions, utilizing land that surrounds communities as buffers for flooding and severe wildfires was something the working group thought had a lot of potential. Local planning should include strategies for using vacant lots and public spaces as part of nature-based solutions, whether that's augmenting urban forests or designing flood mitigation strategies. There are opportunities within communities to take a broader look at mitigation. Next slide, please. There's also, and this is at the tail end of the report, there's also an opportunity for performance metrics for risk reduction. And that's been talked about a bit with building codes and in looking at how we approach building codes. Japan's focus on performance metrics for earthquake, for instance. But I think the working group had a consensus to look at it more broadly as well, and that is that, community risk reduction strategies and building standards should be studied to improve performance, and that is done in a research sense. But in how they're applied in California, it tends to be county by county, city by city, or special district by special district. And so if we can have planning and testing of performance that enables cross-jurisdictional partnerships, the working group thought that could be very effective. And for one example, California has over 300 fire-wise communities striving to reduce community risk throughout the state. But there's not a currently existing way to track performance and make that a learning vehicle among those communities. And I think that, looking forward, the working group felt strongly that moving towards performance metrics will help us learn from communities that are doing well and inform the local decisions and strategies as they're going, so that we don't have to, as they say, reinvent the wheel in every community. We can have a more integrated approach across the state or across the whole country. Next slide, please. And the last point I want to make is that, when it comes to nature-based solutions, the working group tried to generate the initial pieces of a framework for how to go about this. And so we used the word catalyze more nature-based solutions, because part of this is going to be learning through pilot projects. And those pilot projects are going to need to hit on a number of points to prove concepts, whether it's how much risk reduction a wetland provides or how large a community needs to be defined. But four of those components are: what is the asset being protected? What is the peril that's threatening the asset? What natural asset provides resilience? And who benefits from protection? Who should invest in that resilience? And if out of this report, we can launch several pilot projects that are public-private partnerships and answer some of these questions, that can really provide the scalability for something that could be a statewide strategy. Next slide, please. Great. And this graph takes that concept and kind of embeds it in that original starting point of risk assessment, risk communication, risk reduction, and risk transfer. If we're able to link together risk reduction and risk transfer in a way where an insurance policy could incorporate wetland restoration, then an initial investment in wetlands, there on the left in light green, over time could save enough money in the premium for that insurance policy to be financially meaningful to the community and a strategy that they could pursue. And so I think that that's the core way that you could apply these nature-based insurance solutions, is by linking together that risk reduction of the wetland with the insurance policy that may cover a community. And that's hopefully one of the pilot projects that may come out of this. Next slide, please. For concluding points, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I want to just hit on these 3 points to close out here. First, the working group's consensus was that community mitigation and risk transfer pilot projects could close a portion of the protection gap and provide community-wide incentives for risk mitigation. Secondly, nature-based solutions such as wetlands and marshes, urban forests, and ecological forest management can reduce risk to communities, are likely to increase in value over time as they grow and mature, and provide additional community benefits like carbon sequestration. And so therefore, those should be a priority for proof of concept projects and for planning. And finally, without additional investment in risk reduction and improved risk communication, communities will be unprepared and costs will be significant and accelerating as we look at climate risks. And so to break that feedback loop of increasing risks and increasing costs and then diminished capacity to recover, we do need insurance to be able to integrate risk reduction so that we learn from every pilot project and proof of concept project and strengthen communities over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that really informative and great presentation and a great overview of the work that you have done with the California Insurance Group. I'm going to stop sharing this slide so that we can see your face in the video, and I'm at the same time monitoring the Q&A box, inviting our audience to ask questions while I'm waiting for some of them to come in. We have one. I would like to ask you, Mike, how have you communicated? Whoops, I lost it because it was in chat. How have you communicated your findings with other states and internationally to help feed additional work in this space?
Thanks very much for the question. So this is actually kind of a really exciting thing for my part of the department, because we have a climate risk and resilience executive task force at the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which is the longest title in the history of titles. But we have 33 states that participate in that. And so this working group, a subset of them, 5 of the members, presented for 35 minutes to that task force about 3 weeks after the report's release. And I did sort of staff briefings for other states. Internationally, we have this partnership with the United Nations Principles for Sustainable Insurance Initiative. And with them, we're building a sustainable insurance roadmap, which it would basically link recommendations from this report with more of the financial solvency side of the insurance commissioner's role. And so that gives us an avenue to talk with insurance regulators from other countries like Belgium and France, as well as other members of the United Nations. And so we've taken those 2 steps. And I'll just close by saying, the working group has 18 members, of which the insurance commissioner is only 1. So those 17 organizations have also done a really good initial job communicating. The Wharton Business School had 2 different webinars on this topic, and the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance has been communicating this topic. So hopefully that kind of collaborative starting point leads to collaborative communication.
Great. I have a question related to some work that ICC is doing with a group that we've established with the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealand code development and research organizations called the Global Resiliency Dialogue. And that relates to, as you're looking at updating your hazard maps, I assume right now, because of research that we've done, they're based on historical data. As you're updating them, are you looking at integrating more climate science into the risk maps to prepare for future risks, so that a structure built today is ready to handle risks that will impact it 50 years from now?
So this is the jurisdiction of our California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, CAL FIRES as we call it, for when it comes to fire maps. So unfortunately, one of the things that this report identifies is that many of the things that impact insurance affordability happen upstream of the purchase of an insurance policy. So that's hazard mapping, disclosures, etc. As our state agency updates the fire hazard severity maps, I'm not sure what will go into it exactly. I do think that there's a strong emphasis on wanting to look to the future and what those future risks look like, but it falls outside of my role. I do think that, you know, what the report kind of identifies is you have hazard maps. There's also examples of where local government, like Colorado Springs, Colorado, has used a model to sort of inform their mitigation approach. And that certainly can look at climate projections and climate science. But anyway, so to answer your question, it doesn't fall within my role, and so I don't know for sure. But I do think it's really important because ultimately, you know, as you address building codes, you know, and I look at insurance, we want to be looking at the future affordability and what is going to put you know, these communities on the most sustainable footing 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Great. And fair enough. And fortunately, we had CAL FIRE involved in our kickoff discussion. So we're in the right space for the Global Resiliency Dialogue. One more question. Can you talk a little bit about the role of insurance versus state and local governments when it comes to land use decisions? And, you know, how much of the cost of I know, you know, people are moving into more hazard prone areas because of affordability, right? They're moving out of the urban centers, pushing up against the WUI because of the cost of homes, the cost of land. Is the insurance industry kind of trying to push back on that and saying, don't move so close to the wildfire zone? We can't insure your house there? Or is the government sort of allowing it, and is there sort of a push and pull with the zoning regulations in that specific space?
This is a real challenge because most of these decisions are made by local governments. And from the standpoint of this working group and the report, they really identified that, you know, if you're going to focus on affordable housing, you need to be considering risks because a home that burns down is not necessarily going to be affordable, and the costs of evacuation, the costs of insurance, as if those are going to accelerate over time, that is going to dramatically change the affordability of an area from the time it was built. And so I think that, you know, in terms of the insurance industry, you know, being able to, you know, be, I guess you'd say, communicate what the insurance costs are likely to be should be a factor in where and how we build. And it also is a situation of, you know, where insurance is more expensive is higher risks. And so that's where we don't want people to be put unknowingly in harm's way, and making those land use decisions is hard. It's a challenge to for local governments, and it's a challenge for the state. But from this group's point of view, it's not an affordable housing option if the costs spiral out of control because of insurance and risk. And that's something that we can project moving forward.
And maybe continue to struggle with moving forward.
Continue to struggle with. And you know, for flooding in some areas, if we take it out of fire for the moment, you know, there are areas of the California Central Valley where, you know, building in floodplains is restricted for some of these very reasons. And, you know, when you think about how do you approach risk, if you avoid building in a floodplain, you not only reduce the risk to those homeowners, renters, businesses, but you also provide some space to for your mitigation strategies to work. That floodplain can work to your advantage as well. And so I think that the maps, the models, and our climate projections kind of need to come together to inform an overarching strategy on how to build most thoughtfully and climate ready.
Great. Well, some really exciting information still to come, I think, out of California as you're starting to integrate or implement some of these pilot projects and continue to communicate with other jurisdictions and hopefully spearhead some other similar dialogues and projects. So I think I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. So with that, I think I am going to release you and thank you very much for joining us today, for sharing your experience and expertise with us. Fantastic job setting the stage actually for the next panel discussion. And with that, I would like to welcome our panel of Ryan Colker, Ann Cope, and Mark Bove. This is a panel of experts that will be talking about insurance, codes, and climate. And moderating this panel discussion is my colleague, Ryan Colker, ICC's Vice President for Innovation. And as I said, Ryan is joined by Dr. Ann Cope, who is the Chief Engineer at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS, and Mark Bove, who is the Senior Vice President for Natural Catastrophe Solutions at MunichRE Insurance America. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ryan to more fully introduce our experts and kick off the panel discussion. Ryan?
Great. Thanks so much, Judy, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And certainly through the discussion this morning and this afternoon, I think we have a really good stage set for the conversation that Ann, Mark, and I are going to have. So Ann, as you mentioned, is the Chief Engineer at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. She holds a doctorate in civil engineering from the University of Florida, go Gators. Registered professional engineer in South Carolina and Florida. At IBHS, Ann leads the development of research programs to improve performance of structures in hurricanes, wildfires, severe thunderstorms, and hailstorms. She oversees a team of engineers, scientists, and skilled craftspeople who conduct research on full-scale building homes and commercial buildings, which I know she'll share some of the visuals from that work, and is responsible for facilitating the translation of that research into things like building codes and standards. We'll also hear from Mark Bove, who, as Judy mentioned, currently serves as Senior Vice President of Natural Catastrophe Solutions at MunichRE. He is a master's and bachelor's degree holder from the university, from Florida State University. Ann and I will not hold that against him. At MunichRE, he has been using geoscience expertise to improve property catastrophe underwriting for over 20 years. He's responsible for teams that look at developing new natural catastrophe risk products and solutions, automated risk accumulation and budget controls, and parametric products. His work focuses on closing the insurance gap, which we've just heard about, particularly in economically disadvantaged communities. So I think we have a really great conversation before us. As Judy mentioned, I'm Ryan Colker, Vice President of Innovation at the Code Council. I also serve as Executive Director for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. In those roles, I really look across the organization, across the buildings industry, to really identify strategies to support enhanced resilience, enhanced sustainability, and really looking at how codes and standards can be leveraged to support communities in really becoming more resilient. So thank you both for joining us today. I think we're each going to take just a few minutes to talk about sort of our individual roles within the building industry, within insurance, sort of our relationship with codes and standards. Then we'll chat a little bit. And then, certainly if folks within the audience have, questions that, sort of come up during our conversation, certainly, feel free to add those in the Q&A, and we will certainly try and get to as many of those as possible. So let me start with maybe a little bit from sort of the Code Council's perspective and how we engage with the insurance industry. Really there's a wide variety of different outlets. So, Judy mentioned our global resiliency dialogue with codes and standards development and research organizations from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to really find a path forward to address future-focused climate risk. and certainly representatives from insurance domestically and globally have been part of that dialogue, and really a key part of that solution. I think one other important area, and I think both of you will probably touch on it, is around codes and standards development. There's certainly a key role for research from the insurance industry, findings from the insurance industry, opportunities to address risk within codes and standards. So certainly we see insurance participation in the code development process. In the standards development process, our 600 series of standards is in collaboration with IBHS. So really identifying initially sort of wind-related requirements, but also moving into wildfire and seismic risk as well. I did mention our Alliance for National and Community Resilience, which is developing benchmarks to support communities and really understanding where they are relative to resilience, and where are some of the opportunities for them to improve. So within our both our buildings benchmark and our housing benchmark, we really recognize the important role of insurance in that complete picture of community resilience. And so really being able to capture that during that process is really important. A couple other areas, working with folks within the insurance community, the building code effectiveness grading scale really looks at how communities adopt and enforce building codes, which then many insurance companies use to help support sort of their underwriting processes, how they set rates, sort of all of that. And then we see a similar type of program within the flood insurance realm and the community rating system, and so really building codes are a key part of those strategies. And then the final piece I'll mention, particularly in the US, our codes adoption database, which is really a joint effort between the Code Council, Flash, and the ISO, the Insurance Services Office, to really understand where are communities relative to their code adoption. And so it's really providing sort of that common basis for really looking across the country and understanding where our codes adopted. So hopefully that sort of gives, from the Code Council perspective, where we see some really strong engagement from the insurance community. Let me turn it over to Anne and give you an opportunity to share a little bit, about the cool work that IBHS does and sort of how that feeds into the codes process.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Ryan. So I have set up here at the IBHS Research Center so I can show you some of the videos of our work and tell you how the research translates into code and beyond, into standards and into consumer-facing documents. But real quick before I begin, I want to mention to those of you who aren't familiar with, who is this IBHS? What are they? So IBHS is a 501c3. We're a not-for-profit, and we are fully sponsored by the insurance industry. So insurers like MunichRE, my friend Mark Bove, pay a membership dues to our organization, and then we use those funds operationally to do research on buildings to figure out cost-effective ways to make those buildings stronger and more resilient. And that piece is what we get into the codes and the standards. So that's my words, but it's a lot more fun to see it in video. So here's a video of our facility where I am sitting. This is our fan tower. Each one is a 350 horsepower fan. We have 105 of them. So they can do things like this. Tear the shingles literally off the roofs. Investigate what happens when the garage door fails. What happens next? There goes the roof. That building it had windows that were open. That one had a door that was open. And then the internal pressurization overwhelms the building's ability to stay put. We do pieces like that in the research facility so that we can take the information, again, to the standards, to the codes, and into our own fortified system, which is a voluntary beyond code standard. Because as Ryan mentioned, one of the key things is where are the codes? ICC has fantastic model codes. Where are they being used? Not everywhere. FEMA did a study just a year or two ago and found that 65% of local jurisdictions have not taken advantage of using a modern building code. So we have the Fortified program where no matter where you live, you can build it to the Fortified standard, and we know that it will be more resilient, both for homes and businesses. So that's wind. We do wind and wind-driven rain. We also do hail. We go out actually into the Great Plains and measure real hail so that we can bring that information back to the laboratory, recreate it in a realistic way, and test it, test building products against hail in ways that are meaningful. That's a view of our hail machine coming into the facility for the first time. And this is a body cam footage of what it means to grab a new laboratory hailstone, take it over to the test facility, measure it, weigh it, shoot it at an asphalt shingle, and record the result. So here we go, loading it into the breech. We do have to propel them so that they hit at terminal velocity. And boom, that's what it looks like when a very realistic hailstone impacts asphalt shingles, which is very different than using some other material like a steel ball, which is very repeatable, but it doesn't produce the types of damage that you see in the real world. Asphalt shingles are #1 market share here in the United States. There are other products in other places, but hail damage to asphalt shingles is something that we see repeatedly in the United States and Canada. So we are investigating that here, and it translates itself into consumer-facing materials and materials that insurers can use to rank order different building products that have a claim to be hail resistant. So all of these products that are listed on this chart right here have a rating, a hail impact rating, and we are providing a relative scale of their performance because hail is not something that is currently covered by the building code. So moving on to, we've done wind, wind-driven rain, we've looked at hail, wildfire, huge topic right now. We just heard from Mike over in California. So this is some views of wildfire research that we are conducting here at our facility. When something burns, what is the impact on things around it? How quickly does ground fire spread so that we can figure out those wildfire spread models? How do the embers truly react to a building that's in a natural, realistic wind environment? Where do they collect? What are the vulnerable pieces of the structure? How do we make it more resilient to that onslaught of wildfire ember attack? That one's a duplex that you're seeing right now. All poor choices on the left-hand side, all resilient, strong choices on the right-hand side. After 1 minute of exposure to embers, you have a very different picture. One side would be a total loss. The other side is barely affected. These are the types of things that we can do with the research that's here in the laboratory. So wildfire in particular, IBHS is working towards a solution that would meet all of the California Department of Insurance requirements on home hardening. We're taking the research that we've been doing here for the past decade in the research center and putting it into a program for wildfire prepared home. Mike also talked about community. That is our next step. Parcel, home, community, next. We're taking all this decade worth of information and we already have it available, but now we're putting it together into a program that we could roll out for people to use. So that's a bit about who we are and what we do. Up on the screen behind me now are some ways that you can connect with us and find us out there on the web and on social media. But that's who we are and what we do and how we do research to try to bring about change and prevent avoidable losses.
Great, thanks so much, Ann, and always great to see the work that you guys do. Mark, why don't you share a little bit from sort of your role and where you see activities around building codes and standards?
And when I have snazzy videos in my presentations, they always come from the IBHS. So, Anne, I'm jealous. I'm not going to be anywhere near as dynamic or as exciting as what you were able to show. And you guys do a great job. Full disclosure, yes, my organization sponsors the IBHS, and I sit on their research advisory committee. Also, full disclosure, I probably assisted in that California climate recommendations in the background. One of my colleagues sat on that team along with the CDI and other stakeholders and helped synthesize that. And overall, we very strongly support the aspirational goals of that program. Of course, getting things from aspirational to action always becomes quite a challenge. But as Ryan mentioned in my little bio there, is I spent 18 years of my career working in catastrophe risk management for MunichRE's US operations. And during that time is when I really started to develop and understand and appreciate the value of the stronger building codes and what they do for local communities and helping keep that community whole. Because a home that isn't destroyed means a family isn't displaced. It also protects their life safety. And that means an insured doesn't have a claim and possibly a reinsured does have a claim. So building codes ultimately are, combined with land use, a big qualifier, are win-win-win for all stakeholders involved. However, it becomes a challenge, especially when we have the environment and our climate changing around us, and especially the private sector insurers like ourselves want to make sure we are receiving enough premium to cover the basic costs of covering these natural perils. And the answer to that when climate is changing rapidly is not always clear. And Jody, I believe I have a slide, if you could share on the screen. And I want to say as the slide comes up that I've been on site after many major natural disasters over the past 20 years of my career. After the hurricanes in Florida of 2004, it was very obvious to see that codes that were just built to the newly implemented codes after Andrew, and it did take a decade after Andrew really to get them in place, that the newer construction was holding up. We got further confirmation of that in 2004 with Wilma in South Florida and Irma in 2017. Areas like Marco Island, where over half of the building stock is post-Andrew code, fared much better than Monroe County, the Florida Keys, where a lot of the construction is much older due to the railroad going down, and also a lot more wood frame construction as compared to the cinder block wall construction that you see in Peninsular Florida. We also saw in 2005 how those benefits of building codes did not transfer to the northern Gulf Coast in Mississippi and Alabama, who at the time did not have strong building codes. Further later on, I saw this in California. I joined the IBHS in Paradise 6 weeks after the Camp Fire. And again, there are examples where mitigating individual properties likely save homes. And yes, there's absolutely space for that community mitigation. The question is, what ultimately is that benefit? And are we still getting enough risk adequate premium to cover some of these risks? So, insurance ultimately is a societal risk transfer mechanism. And so we kind of follow the fortunes of what our society, how it decides to act and how to behave. And when it comes to natural catastrophes, we've seen a lot of people move to coastal regions over the past 50 years, growth of urban centers and growth of exurbs and suburbs. And so when we look at NatCat data, and here I'm comparing tropical cyclones compared to the three perils we would call higher frequency cats: wildfire, convective storm, which includes tornado, hail, and winter storm. And we can see that the trend is very obviously upwards in all these. But of course, with tropical cyclone, we have a lot of interannual variability. There's some years we have no landfalls, though the past 5 years feels like that never happened before. But we have years with very little activity for that. And then we do have big spikes in very active years where large populations were. But the loss trends, if you take out the tropical cyclone, become even more telling of what's going on in our society and the environment. Because is also a tropical cyclone. Some of the states have gotten the message. Florida and Louisiana now have codes. Alabama has some of the highest concentration of fortified homes on the coast of the United States within it. But if you can go to the next slide, I'd like to itemize. I want to show, overall, these more frequent cats are more costly to insurers on an annual basis over the past decade than tropical cyclones itself. This does not include 2021 with the ice storm and Ida, but on average, wildfire, convective storm, and winter storm over the past decade have caused about $8 billion more in damage than tropical cyclones. One more tab forward, please. And this is what it looks like when you break it down by SCS, winter storm, and wildfire. And what we really see is, the effects of our society's decisions over the past century plus now coming back to haunt us more now that our climate risk is shifting as well. If we look at the green bars for convective storm, that is largely a signal of people moving in the United States to more active regions, combined in a lot of areas with very, very poor wind and building codes for impact due to hail. And so that's driven a lot of the increase we're seeing there. And of course, with a warmer atmosphere, there's a chance for more convective storm. For winter storm, we see, the societal piece with the lack of building codes in Texas had a huge proportion in that unprecedented blue bar of $10 billion plus of loss from that event. And of course, the rapid drying and particularly the warmer, drier nights in California have exacerbated the wildfires. And of course, not all the numbers are in on this season, so that orange bar for 2021 is relatively low. So we have rapidly increasing costs, and the wildfires in California alone in 1617 wiped out all policyholder surplus from personal lines insurers in California since 1990. So obviously, the hazard has shifted underneath our feet, and the insurers are trying to catch up, and the states are trying to catch up, and we need to continue to come together to talk to each other to find solutions to make this more affordable to individual persons, to communities, to disadvantaged communities, and so on. And with that, I will stop for now, and let's get into a discussion.
Yeah, no, that's great, and really appreciate having sort of the visual perspective of what happens to buildings and the economic perspective of what does that actually mean for insurers and homeowners and business owners. So I think having sort of both sides of that picture are really essential. We've already talked about a little bit from Mike's presentation and then both of your presentations on sort of this wide spectrum of, let's call them, needs within the codes and standards landscape. So, we have, Mark, as you mentioned, places, and you mentioned as well, places without, codes at all, or, very old codes. And then you have this recognition that, even the most up-to-date model codes are still backwards looking and don't really address the challenges that, we're likely to face 50, 100 years into the future. Any thoughts on, how do we assure that we're addressing the needs of, everyone across those spectrums? So, bringing up folks that don't have codes while, assuring that, we continue to move forward and improve the codes we have.
Yeah, that's a multifaceted, loaded question, right? Because there's so many different pieces there. So what we try to put first is let's make sure that people are paying attention to the peril that's of interest. Make sure people are actually aware that there is a peril in your area, and you need to be cognizant of it. You need to know what the risks are, and do you know if you have a building code? Because you mentioned the collaboration that you guys have with Flash, which I think is fantastic. What we hear so often is people presume that here we live in a wonderful country. Of course, we have a building code, and people presume that in many different places around the world. In some places, that's true. Our Canadian friends do a great job of making sure that there are building codes in every jurisdiction. But for some reason here in the United States, we don't do that. So first and foremost, in the United States, awareness and awareness about the lack of code can be the catalyst. And that's exactly what happened in South Alabama. Alabama does not have a statewide building code. And there are places up in the northern part of that particular state where I would love to see them do better, particularly because they have such a tornado risk, right, and severe convective storm risk. But the southern part of Alabama has said, not again. We're not going to do that again. After Katrina went through, they said no, and they have voluntarily taken the pieces of the fortified standard and put them into the local codes. So in many ways, that local effort can spur something that then grows. And eventually, I'd love to see that state take on a statewide building code.
Great, and I think certainly the report that you guys do on rating the states is really a great way to help communicate sort of where states sit on the code landscape. Mark, anything from your perspective on addressing those particular issues?
Yes, I completely agree with Ann that we need to get consumers and people looking for a place to live more information. People care more about what the countertops look like than realizing that they have a roof that's fortified and can resist, or that, the landscaping is fire resistant, or they're using, fire retardant materials on the outside. We need to do a better job. And of course, it's not just the insurers, it's the real estate and that market, it's contractors as well. But ultimately, Michael, the question was asked earlier, when does insurance get involved? In some aspects, we get involved far after the risk is already created. So, we need also work on the societal side, as Michael mentioned, to say, does it make sense to build here? Just in this past week, my meteorologist colleague at one of our subsidiaries noted that a developer has now leased the land that a Six Flags used to sit on in New Orleans that was under 5 feet of water during Katrina. We continue, especially right after a disaster, people are so quick trying to get repaired that we're not doing mitigation that could be done during those repairs. The impetus to get everything done and back to normal is so strong that we miss that opportunity to retrofit and mitigate. So, and last, we build Addicts Reservoir. There are communities that got flooded that are literally sitting in a reservoir. So, and same thing, there might be places in wildfire country where it ultimately doesn't make sense to build. And we come in after all those decisions are made. So there needs to be, and then, we have to deal with it. And if it's a risky area, the price is going to be much higher. So there needs to be more communication on those fronts, even with the contractors. Say, you build this is what it's going to cost people that are going to live here. Is it the price point that they can afford? And also the contractors, once they're done with the development, their risk drops to zero and they have no skin in the game, which is another challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, and really appreciate that perspective. Since we're talking to a global audience, maybe if each of you can touch on, how you engage with maybe counterparts or other organizations in an international forum on maybe sharing best practices, joint research opportunities. Many of the hazards that both of you have addressed, are common elsewhere. So how does that dialogue work?
Oh, sure. We have plenty of colleagues that we communicate with regularly in Australia through James Cook University. They have a fantastic cyclone testing station. So we might call the storms by a different name, but they wreak the same levels of damage. So we study wind and wind-driven rain together with people from James Cook University. We've got a handful of projects that we've worked over the years, and some ongoing ones right now, particular to wind-driven rain. We also collaborate with them and ask them questions about codification of wildfire pieces, because Australia has such a wildfire risk the same way that we do. And we've been in close collaboration with ICLR, which is the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Research up in Canada. So they face many of the same wildfire and hail perils that we face here. So we collaborate on many different fronts. We've got colleagues over in Europe where they face flooding and hail, and we also have wind conversations with them. Every couple of years, we get together as an international group of wind engineers. That's always a fantastic discussion to share whatever research has gone on, where you're headed, which way it's going. So we do our best to really maintain that global focus while we're bringing value to our members who are most concerned about insurance in the United States.
And Mark, I know MunichRE is an international organization, but and I know you work in primarily the U.S. context, but how do you engage with your international colleagues?
Oh, absolutely. You are correct. My focus is primarily on North America, U.S. focus, but we have a team of engineers and geoscientists that work around the world to communicate with our clients and to the local communities on what they should be doing to mitigate the risk to their structures for any peril out there. Still, the largest loss in MunichRE history based on our policyholder surplus is the 1906 Great San Francisco earthquake. Our founder traveled there from Munich at the time personally to cut the checks out to the local insurance companies there. And more recently, in the 70s, the Cyclone Tracy in Darwin, Australia, and the Tangshan earthquake that killed 250,000 people in China led our international to form our Geo Risk Committee, which of course includes these engineers to help communicate. So we're going on site globally, looking at the liquefaction damage after Christchurch. We look at and find after the Izmit earthquake, the infill of concrete is they're not doing the concrete fully. They're putting in ballast to try to save on concrete. So you find so many things of what's being done and communicate how to risk this, because ultimately this isn't just a U.S. problem. It is global, and we are trying to talk to anyone that will listen in any place around the world that these losses don't have to happen. If we get to code plus, because our codes of today don't handle the weather we get today, let alone what we might have in a future climate. So we need to get that message through and try to, on all fronts, try to reduce these losses going forward.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that, and I think the recognition that many countries are dealing with similar challenges, and sort of the more we can share information, I think that certainly the better off we'll be. One thing that I know has become very sort of focused on both domestically and internationally is the Surfside condo collapse, and particularly sort of the focus it's brought on the importance of ongoing maintenance and addressing existing buildings. For the most part, insurance is focused on existing buildings. How has the conversation, within your organization, within the broader insurance industry shifted post Surfside, and what are some thoughts on maybe how to sort of increase the focus on existing buildings and maintenance needs?
Mark, you want to take a stab and then you want me to go first?
I can, and I think you're better on the engineering side. I don't deal personally with building collapse a lot, but the environment that caused that collapse is a very real concern anywhere where salt water and intrusion are, and making sure that that poured concrete does not get cracked. That, I don't know the full, and the report from the government has to come out, but likely the cracks in the reinforced concrete getting to the metal rebar and eroding it is probably a likely factor. But this is one of the issues also with the lack of building codes. Surfside, that condo was built in the gold rush boom of the 70s in Florida before strong building codes were implemented. And there is a tremendous building stock, particularly in the 3 South Florida counties on the Atlantic coast, where you have a lot of building stock that's old, that was really not built up to modern code. And I think you're going to see insurers taking a much closer look at the structural stability of these buildings going forward, especially with open lower level garage decks and pools and the water that can influence it going forward. But we need to understand what's with modern construction if this is a risk as well, because as good as our codes are, we always continually learn from new events and what happens and how to apply it. A good example is the Northridge earthquake in in 94, it was afterwards discovered that some of the steel joints buried within did not function as well as we hoped and caused code. Other earthquakes have updated code. So I hope we can use Surfside as a wake up and take a more critical look at both older buildings, but also are we doing better now? And if not, how do we address that? Other forms of mitigation, it's expensive. From what I read, Surfside, had years of debate over the cost of that repair that needed to be done. It wasn't a secret that they had an issue. And, it's tough to get that, and it's tough for everyone. So, we need to also look for the place where we can get low-hanging fruit, like with individual residences and buildings, putting a secondary water seal on the roof. If you're getting your roof replaced already, the cost of that is about an extra $150, depending on the size of your roof. That's low hanging, and it could save you literally hundreds of thousands in water damage by doing it. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Ann.
Yeah, you're right, Mark. The engineering is spot on what you mentioned. The National Institute for Standards and Technology will come up with a definitive report, but it's going to take them a while to go through all of the details and come up with a good definitive report about all the many things that appear to have been wrong with that building. So it was clearly showing signs of distress. It's a tragic opportunity to describe to people that buildings are not permanent. They look and feel permanent to a lot of people who aren't engineers because concrete is hard. It looks permanent, and it is not. So there are some great things that we can do in terms of just presenting, what are the questions that I should ask if I live in a high-rise building that's anywhere around the world and happens to be in a place where there's a lot of salty air. These are questions that people can and should ask. It will be interesting to see what kind of shifts happen as a result of this tragedy. I look over to other places along the coast, along the Gulf Coast, along any coast where there could be a hurricane or a cyclone, and I think those are the areas that have all the salty air, and it doesn't take a hurricane or a cyclone to bring down a building if it's not properly maintained. It's such a terrible and tragic event, and it goes to the conversation that we were having a few minutes ago about affordability, not just purchase price day one affordability, but long-term, what are all the costs? How do we capture that and make it knowable and understandable for people? What are the long-term affordability pieces of different structures? And it takes a lot of different stakeholders. And right now, not all of them are present or having a piece of the conversation on purchase day. And that's something we got to figure out how to work on.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very important perspective. And I think we can talk a little bit about that. If folks do have, questions for Ann or Mark, please do, add them to the Q&A, and we will certainly try and get to them. But, Mark, in your bio, I mentioned your work around, vulnerable populations and, trying to advance, protection for those communities. And you just mentioned, the importance of a sort of total cost of ownership, total cost of rental approach. So we really understand that it's not just about the first costs. Mark, why don't we start with you? What are some of the strategies that you've been using to really engage vulnerable populations and really sort of bring that message that they need to be a part of the conversation? And as Mike mentioned, they're the least likely to be able to bounce back from a hazard event.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are working with several different organizations. We've reached out to the NAACP because a lot of disadvantaged communities also have environmental justice and pollution issues. And also we're working with public housing to try to help them figure out novel insurance solutions because, those people at risk, especially for renters or even the landlords themselves, don't really have the funds to mitigate and protect. So, we're looking at a lot of novel ways to try to close the insurance gap within these markets. And Michael actually mentioned a few of them that we're looking at. One could be the parametric trigger that, if a river rises to a certain level, there's a guaranteed payout whether there is damage or not. And maybe if there isn't much damage, some of that fundage actually still gets paid out, and it goes to some of the natural mitigation techniques and the green infrastructure that is needed. The same thing, if there's a fire nearby a community and some defined triggers hit, maybe they get some money to do some control burns or clear brush in the other wings that's causing the more extreme fire behaviors. So we are looking at any and all, but unfortunately, I have to say it is quite the challenge. It might be the challenge of my career, because if these were easy communities to reach, and people would have figured it out already, because and business always tries to find a way where they can get revenue streams no matter what. But ultimately, we think there are ways, novel ways, by either using the community or other types of groups as a pooling agency to try to help people. Particularly, maybe you keep that tail risk that's less expensive under your policy, but maybe the city helps you buy out the lower part of your risk that's usually more expensive in your insurance premium. So we're looking at a number of ways, but it is a challenge. But we are innovating. We actually are on the market in California with a new wildfire product for homeowners, but it is in the non-admitted market, which does not need CDI approval due to the risk adequate. And we would love to work with them, figure out ways to start developing new opportunities for products in the admitted market out there as well.
Great, thanks, Mark, and really appreciate you guys working on that. Ann, anything from your perspective?
Well, so one of the things that we are working on and we'll roll out next year. So I've already mentioned the wildfire prepared home, which is for single family homes. But one thing that we're going to roll out soon is you'll see fortified for multifamily housing. And so we're really hoping that to work with housing and urban development, to work with other places where that could be the standard by which affordable housing is constructed. So let's do the best construction possible for those places where we are intentionally putting in affordable housing. So we're trying to make that widely available so that people can use it and not have to reinvent the wheel every time. Here it is. This is how you do it. And we're working really hard to make sure that we're getting the word out and establishing those connections.
And let's not always place those communities in areas that flood. Historically, they've been disadvantaged that way, and we need to figure out ways to reduce that risk, whether it's elevating their properties or finding other insurance solutions.
Yeah, and if you're going to elevate it, you might as well get the roof on right? So because the flood may come by and the hurricane that created the flood has now ripped off the roof. So we need to be looking holistically at what we're doing, and I think we're making some good strides. It never feels like it's enough. I'm always passionate about doing more, but I feel like we're making some good strides there.
No, I truly feel, Ann, that all the stakeholders want the same outcome. It's just so complicated and a challenge. It's how do you get those parts of the jigsaw puzzle to actually fit? I think we'll get there, but it's unfortunately going to still take more time to get done. But I am confident that we'll get there.
Yeah, I really appreciate the focus, and certainly from the Code Council and sort of the implementation and development of codes, having greater community involvement in that process is certainly an essential piece of the picture. And so we've been engaging folks at MAACP and other organizations to really build knowledge around codes. And how to be involved and how to be engaged and assure that the folks that participate in that process reflect the communities that are adopting and implementing those codes. We did have a couple questions come in. One was specifically on the role of mortgage lenders in sort of organizing sort of the big picture of total cost of ownership and engaging insurance in that conversation. And maybe I'll add sort of real estate agents to that piece as well. Any thoughts on sort of how all of those pieces should come together, could come together, to really sort of give that holistic, total cost of ownership picture?
I guess that's going to go to me.
Go for it.
I'll try to do as best as I can. Yes, you do need mortgages. Banks in the United States require hazard coverage if you have a mortgage in this country. They don't care as long as you get coverage, they're laissez-faire. They just need proof that you have it, or you pay through it for your escrow. I actually wish mortgage companies in this country would double check on their policyholders' flood insurance, because while they check on the general hazard every year, they usually don't check whether they have flood coverage or in the A or V zone. In fact, studies from Warden show that about 1/3 of people drop their flood insurance coverage within 3 years of getting their mortgage. And, if they're not being forced, I hate to say it, sometimes requirements make for better behavior. So you see the better take-up rate, but you see the relatively low flood take-up rates that Michael Peterson mentioned previously. In many inland counties in the U.S., the take-up rate is less than 1% of all housing units, but everyone has flash flood risk and everyone should have flood insurance. I think there's ways to go. I think, having apps like, whether it's the National Weather Service talking about the risk at a point that you're looking at, or Zillow or other types of real estate-based apps, I think ultimately one of the themes going forward in the 2020 that was really coined very well by Ann's big boss, Roy Wright at the IBHS, is we need to be honest with our society and our individuals about the NatCat and climate risk they face at their location. If we're not honest with them, we're never really going to have change. Look what's happening with the risk rating 2.0 for the National Flood Insurance that's actually gone through now. This is an effort for our government to tell the truth about flood risk along the coast and rivers across the country. And in many places, particularly along the coast, it is much more expensive than what they've been buying. And yes, there's going to be tremendous pain in some communities during this, and which is why I say, as a societal risk transfer, we need society to help. Is for lower income people, that the climate landscape has shifted underneath them. Can we give them financial support to get risk adequate premiums? Maybe ultimately people realize, this is not sustainable. A lot of people move out of New Jersey when they retire to get rid of the regular property tax, the high property taxes here. People might need to do that for catastrophe risk as well. But if they don't know it, we are just going to end up throwing more cash at the same exact problem. The insurance gap will remain, and we will still be talking about these same exact problems 20 years from now when I retire.
Yeah, I think the importance of having that risk signal, I think is really important. One sort of related area that I'll give a shout out to is Flash actually just put out a buyer's guide for resilient homes, and so I know IBHS helped with that, as did ICC, but really providing prospective homeowners with what do I need to think about? What questions do I need to ask? If I'm looking at various different properties, and how do I understand property X is maybe a little more resilient than property Y, and what impact would that have on my family? So I think that's tools like that I think are incredibly important. But it also highlights sort of the role of many different actors within this space that really need to come together to really have the right messages, the right information. So, finance, insurance, realtors, contractors, code officials, home inspectors, sort of all of those pieces. So, really, really great conversation. I don't see any additional questions. Anything else that you guys want to add that folks maybe should know about that we didn't touch on?
If people want to go and check and see, if you're in the United States and you want to go and check that website to see, what is your current jurisdiction, if you have a code or not, it's inspect2protect.org. You can Google search it and you can find it. inspecttoprotect.org. And all you need is your address or your zip code, and go check. And, I always like to tell people, what happened in Alabama was a grassroots effort, because a couple of people got loud and said that they weren't going to do it anymore. And so it takes all of us moving small steps forward. So if you go to that website and you find out, oh, holy schmoly, my county, I live in the county and not in the city, and we have no building code. Well, the next step is, who is your county official? And take some ownership, and go ahead, be loud. Say that you prefer to have a building code, because I can be loud all the time, but I'm only one voice. And so it takes many stakeholders, and I would encourage people to go ahead and do their one small part. Get involved.
Great. Yeah, certainly a wonderful message. Mark, anything to add from your perspective?
No, I like that message. Do your research. You're not necessarily can rely on real estate agents or others being able to tell you. There's articles that in Miami Beach, they say, oh, we have money, we'll throw cash at the problem, it's the real estate market's fine. But and that's part of the lesson from the risk rating 2.0 for NFIP, is we need to start telling the truth about the current and future costs of this. Otherwise, nothing is really going to change. And the reality is that many areas along our coast, or in narrow valleys where high precipitation events can occur, or out west in our bone dry dead forests out there, that the risk has changed. It's much higher, and we need to explain to people how that risk has changed, and figure out as a community and as a society how to address it. The state of California isn't going to figure this out alone on its own. The building code community is not. The insurance industry is not. We all need to come together collectively to try to get this solution out there.
Great. Well, Ann and Mark, really appreciate the conversation. I think sort of the lessons learned is do your research and get loud, and hopefully we can sort of continue to work on advancing community resilience. So really appreciate the conversation. I'm going to turn it back to Judy to wrap us up.
Thank you, Ryan. And thank you so much, Ann and Mark, for joining us. Thank you also again to all of our presenters today, Mike, and those presenters who participated in our first session. We're giving you a few minutes back of your day as this concludes the 2021 Global Connections Day virtual event. I hope that you have walked away with some newfound knowledge and insights from the day's program. We really do have a lot to learn from one another, and bringing smart people from around the world to do just that is why we hold our annual Global Connections Day. Hopefully, we'll be back in person next year during the annual conference in Louisville in September, and I hope that you'll plan to join us again. Have a great day, afternoon, evening, or night, wherever you are in the world, and thanks again for spending time with us today.